Now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are back at Philosophy Show. Amos and I have a new video conversation, and we figured out that we were going to talk about some interesting philosophical issues. It could be multiple, could be one in particular, but at least one topic we could begin talking about is the concept of metaphysics. What is metaphysics, and what are some examples or applications thereof? So I consider metaphysics to be a very important topic. In fact, I would argue that it's the most important topic, or at least the deepest topic, that everything else, all of the branches of knowledge, rests on metaphysics as its most fundamental foundation. So I would consider that very important. So what kind of beliefs people have are dependent upon metaphysics, which we also addressed before. So Amos, perhaps we could then start off by discussing what metaphysics is. How would you define metaphysics?
Yes, thank you for introducing the topic, and I agree with you that metaphysics is in some sense the basis of all the beliefs that a person holds, because so let's start with the definition of metaphysics. The way I understand it, metaphysics is this part of philosophy that concerns itself with the question of existence. So what is existence? Perhaps how do we know that something exists, or what exists? And also, what is the essence of these things that exist? So one example of a metaphysical assumption that is quite common today, it's, I think, at the basis of natural science, is that only material particles, or perhaps matter and energy, exist. And so, but of course, we see very quickly that what you believe reality is made up out of in its most fundamental essence will influence many, if not all, of your other assumptions or conclusions that you hold about reality. So I think that's my start for a definition. Yeah.
Good points. I would also say something similar to that. I would consider metaphysics to be the branch of philosophy dealing with reality as such, or existing things as such. How can we understand things that exist? Being. How can we understand being? How can we comprehend the different things we see around us? So we can thus realize that whatever we think or say or believe about some part of reality, and whatever conclusions we obtain based on our thinking or experiments, are always based upon some fundamental principles of what things are and what kind of things we are talking about, and what are the necessary principles that direct and organize everything we see around us. So for instance, science deals with understanding material, natural things. At least natural science does that. But whatever science says about reality is dependent upon fundamental principles about what is being, and what kind of properties can we talk about things as such, and yes, and all these principles that everything else rests on. And everyone has metaphysical beliefs. It's unavoidable. It's inevitable. We always believe something about reality on which everything else rests. For instance, we all the time we distinguish between different kinds of being. We recognize that trees, rocks, human beings, and rabbits They're all beings, they're all things in reality. However, they're still different from each other. But how can we say that they are different yet still exist? Well, that is a metaphysical issue. It deals into the fundamental structure of being itself. And there we could talk about essence, we could talk about purpose, teleology, and matter and form, and all those very interesting concepts. And all the time in our everyday lives, all the time we distinguish between different kinds of things. We distinguish between essence and properties, contingency and necessity. We distinguish between essential properties, accidental properties, etc. So yes, that would be a brief presentation of metaphysics from my side. What do you think about these remarks?
Yes, I think you brought up some good remarks. I especially like perhaps even to call metaphysics the branch of philosophy that deals with reality as such, so that asks the question of what is reality, because existence is kind of a word that has become a little bit less used in this metaphysical sense in our common language, but reality is used very widely. So, and for example, I myself have maintained in multiple discussions that reality doesn't care about your feelings. Things are just the way they are, and it doesn't matter if you want them to be that way or not, or if you feel a certain way about it or not, because reality just is the way it is. But what does this actually mean? And there you pointed out very rightly that every person has some metaphysical assumptions. It's really impossible not to have them, because I think at least since René Descartes, there is this great idea that at least the least thing that I can be certain of is that I, as the consciously thinking entity, exist. And therefore, even if nothing else exists, this already is a metaphysical claim or a metaphysical statement, that only I, as the conscious thinker, exist. And of course, there are different metaphysical axioms or ground suppositions that people can hold, like everything is made out of atoms, everything is made out of very small particles. Or in the ancient world, there used to be this idea that there are 4 elements: water, earth, fire, and air. And everything is made out of a combination of these 4 elements. And so this is a different metaphysical proposition. And now you can, of course, say, well, this is obviously false because of this or that reason. But whenever you kind of call one metaphysical proposition false, you can only do so by explicitly or implicitly having another metaphysical kind of statement in your mind. It's not possible to have no metaphysical assumption at all.
Right, good points. And I just had this thought right now that all other branches of knowledge, science, all beliefs, could be categorized or termed applied metaphysics. It's metaphysics applied to particular situations or cases or things. So I would say that makes very much sense, because metaphysics is the basis of everything. As you say, it's fundamental to all kinds of beliefs and knowledge. So yes, even if you have a person who is very skeptical that we can know a lot of things about reality, still, at least some of them, I hope, would admit that I exist as a thinking subject, as an entity. But that entails, as you say, metaphysical principles, that there is this entity in reality that has the property of being a thinking, rational agent. And Furthermore, I would argue that you can also immediately know that you have an intellect and a will. And then we can talk about, okay, what is the nature of the intellect? What is the nature of the will? And thus you dive into deep metaphysics based on those certain beliefs. And yes, whenever you do science, you always consider material things and their essences and their properties. And metaphysics is a tool that you use all the time, whether you go into the forest and you examine trees, grass, plants all around you, you immediately comprehend metaphysical principles when you do that. And one could also talk about people who do mathematics. All mathematics are based upon logic, logical inferences, logical conclusions and deductions. And thus, from that, you can talk about the principles of logic itself as fundamental to all mathematics. But the principle of logic itself is, you could argue, metaphysical. So yes, it's interesting to note how fundamental it is. And it's disappointing that so many philosophers and, or at least some philosophers and many other people deny that metaphysics are important. They believe that metaphysics have been somehow replaced by natural science, but that's not the case one bit. There is no natural science to speak of without metaphysics.
Yes, because natural science is based on certain metaphysical axioms, or certain metaphysical axioms, basically. And of course, as soon as you start to debate these axioms or to question them, then you start to question the entire building that natural science has built up. So I think you have brought up a couple of interesting points, which we could all pursue further. One is this idea that certain people might maintain that we cannot know much for certain. And I think it was a good point that you mentioned that at least they would have to admit, if they are honest, that they as the conscious entity exist, and also that they have an intellect and a will, which is very interesting, because, for example, people could deny that they have, like, not exactly feelings, but sensory, like that they perceive things, that they have perceptions, because they could say, no, these perceptions are just an illusion. But then it would have to be kind of an illusion of either the intellect or the will, or both, because it's almost impossible to imagine or to see the conscious being without these two faculties of intellect and will, because you immediately see that you can perceive certain things, and you can there are thoughts in the mind, and these thoughts can be, for example, judged as logical or illogical, and this has to do with the intellect. And also perhaps there is a certain desire or aversion which would have to do with the will. And I think, yeah, you cannot deny these things, which is an interesting realization. And then we could talk about this position of radical skepticism, which I find to be quite annoying, but still some people hold it. So perhaps we could talk about this. Also, yeah, perhaps that was one thing that stuck in my mind from what you have said.
Yeah, interesting points. And I would say that to those who claim that, well, what if our perceptions are simply illusory? Well, even then, there is someone experiencing the illusion. There is no illusion without a subject or an agent experiencing that. So that doesn't contradict the fact that we know with certainty that we ourselves existing as thinking entities. So even those who claim that, well, what if reality is solipsism? I'm not sure if we have addressed solipsism before, this idea that only your mind exists and everything else around you is an illusion, it's an imagination of your mind. And even if one were to say, well, perhaps solipsism is true, we cannot disprove it. Well, even then we have to say that we know with certainty that we ourselves exist because we experience ourselves. We just comprehend ourselves immediately because we are ourselves literally. And thereby you can make metaphysical conclusions that, okay, something exists in reality, namely my own being. I have the faculty of intellect, I have the will, I am a rational agent because I can distinguish logic from illogical things. You can comprehend truth, you can direct your thought to different fields or things, and you can reason from premises to conclusions, and you realize that you have all these properties within yourself, and thus you have a lot of metaphysics there. Also, I would say that when it comes to perceptions, there is some external source of those perceptions. And there's a person I know who has made this argument that the mind itself is purely passive. It simply receives information. It simply receives concepts, perceptions, and all these kinds of things. The mind itself is simply a passive thing. It doesn't produce things of itself. It simply receives. It is a power that comprehends, receives, acquires knowledge, experience, etc. So you could argue that perception, even if our perception is flawed, as some would argue, it still has a source in reality. Now, this would perhaps get into questions of epistemology, which is a huge field in and of itself. But at least I would say that there are problems with radical skepticism. And also another thing about radical skepticism. I'm not an expert about what radical skeptics maintain about specific, precise things, but it seems that, for instance, one radical skeptic named William James, a 20th century thinker and was very influential in the modern school system, he promoted this idea of pragmatism, the idea that we shouldn't talk about truth, absolute truth, what we can know, etc. We should only talk about what is useful. Or perhaps I have mischaracterized him a little bit. Perhaps he will say that, well, some of these things are important, but for him, the primary value of discussions and philosophy is whether they are useful, they are pragmatically good. So he promoted this idea of pragmatism. So that's at least one manifestation of radical skepticism that I know of. But also there we see huge problems, because how can something be useful unless it corresponds to reality in some way? Even there, it presupposes metaphysical assumptions. Or else it would make sense to talk about something being useful without referring to something in reality being useful and being able to make analysis and examinations about in what way things are useful, how beings can relate to each other, etc. So yes, that's some thoughts right there.
Yes, interesting thoughts that you brought up there. I had two main points I wanted to address. So one is, it's an interesting question that I haven't like a strong opinion on it, but it could be interesting if somebody were a radical skeptic and he would only be certain that he as the thinking entity exists. Is there, the question is, okay, for example, can I, this conscious entity that is the only thing that exists, have I come into existence? And can I go out of existence, or is consciousness kind of infinite? And I think I'm not sure if how a radical skeptic would address these points, because you could say, well, at some point in your life, you were not conscious, or perhaps there was one moment when you first realized that you are conscious, like you realized that you had this kind of flash of awareness, where before that you never experienced this. And so that would kind of imply that there is something else that exists besides your consciousness, because it came about, and that means something must have caused it to come about. And so that would be an interesting route to follow. And the other thought was also that in some sense, it's kind of not so important whether somebody, for example, is a solipsist or a materialist or whatever, because even if I perceive that all of the things in reality, if I think all of these things are just kind of in my imagination or in my consciousness, and this is the only thing that exists, then still I see that they follow certain like unchangeable laws, basically, if you want to call it so. So for example, whenever I have the illusion that I eat something, then I will have the illusion that I'm no longer hungry or that I'm satisfied. And whenever the illusion doesn't eat something, then the illusion also is hungry. Or whenever one illusion beats the other illusion, then the other illusion feels pain, etc. Or it acts as though it feels pain. And so there is still the consistency of reality, and most of the practical aspects of reality or of everyday life are still kind of the same. And so that's why then it's kind of, in the end, I think Pascal's wager that kind of just kills this solipsistic idea for me, because if it seems as though every other person behaves in the same way that I do and experiences the same things that I do, and if all of this seems logically consistent, then it's just in the end the easier explanation to just assume that it actually is the way it seems. But Pascal's wager is also an interesting question in this whole metaphysical debate.
Right. Yes, good points you brought up there. And I would also make the same point which you brought up, that the mind or the intellect that we possess, it cannot be the totality of all reality. There must be something which grounds our intellect or our mind. There must be some cause behind it, unless our mind or intellect were God himself. But we know that we are not the supreme God. So yes, we would say that, okay, we understand metaphysically that there is something other than the mind that sustains it in existence. At least that's what I would say. So I would actually, yeah, sorry.
May I ask how, like, speaking as a very radical skeptic, how would you know that?
Know what specifically?
That the mind isn't God or isn't all-encompassing, and that something must therefore ground the mind.
Well, that's a huge issue in itself, but if I were to briefly address that, I would say that, well, first thing is we know that our minds are not infinite because we acquire knowledge. We are in a state where we are ignorant of something, and then we acquire knowledge that we didn't have before. But that is impossible if our mind was all-encompassing, because then there would be nothing left for us to know. So that's one point. And when it comes to the point of how we know that there must be something beyond that, based on that fact, I would say that our mind is either it's contingent, that it depends on some cause for its existence, or it is necessary, it exists by its own power, by the necessity of its own nature. But if it existed by its own power, by the necessity of its own nature, then I would argue that necessarily our mind would have attributes that our mind doesn't have, such as eternity, and if the essence of it being pure existence itself, that it is perfect, and other things, that it must be one of a kind. So I would actually argue that things that exist by their own power necessarily have to have divine attributes. Now, to dive into why, or I believe this, or how to argue for it, that would take a huge discussion in itself. And I know that we have talked about this in an earlier conversation about the existence of God, etc. But just to put it very briefly, I would say that, okay, we know that our minds are not infinite, and we know that if our minds existed without any cause whatsoever, it would have attributes that it doesn't have. Hence, it's the other option, that the mind are contingent upon some other cause.
Interesting. Thanks for elaborating on that. I think, sorry, the argument that our mind is not infinite because we acquire knowledge or something can come into our mind or our consciousness, I think that's a very good argument. And I wonder if a solipsist could reasonably dispute this. I mean, you could say, well, it comes from another part of my consciousness that isn't connected with this part of my consciousness, but that's basically just an ad hoc hypothesis, because how do you know that this other part of your mind exists if you don't experience it? So from the point of the conscious subject, it really is the fact that things come into my mind, be they thoughts or illusions or whatever, but they must have come from somewhere, because else they would have already been there forever. So perhaps, and okay, so I think this point for me is kind of, we can tick that off, that's a good one. And now the contingent versus necessary question, perhaps we could go into it a little bit more. I was just thinking right now, I think one of the attributes that classical Christian theology, as we have talked about sometimes, attributes to God is that he is unchangeable, or that he is kind of always the same. And I'm not sure if something necessarily has to be unchangeable in order that we could assume that it just exists by itself forever without being caused or created. But the point before, that something can come into my mind, at least demonstrates that my mind is also not unchangeable, because it does change when a new thought arises. So that was just something that I thought as you were talking.
Yeah, interesting points. And yeah, the first point I had in mind while you were talking about this is that, yes, when we see that our minds acquire knowledge, that means that there must be something besides our mind. Because the radical skeptic, who, if he were to respond, well, what if there is some part of our mind that we hadn't awareness of the content of that part until a future point in time? However, that would make sense, because if there was a point in the past where we were not aware of the content of that part of the mind, then it wouldn't be a part of our mind, because our mind concerns that of which we are aware. And that's especially clear when talking about consciousness. It's impossible to have a part of consciousness that we are not aware of, because all of consciousness, by definition, is that which we are conscious of. So you couldn't have a part of the consciousness of which we're ignorant in the past. that goes against the very nature of consciousness. So yes, the content of mind, when we acquire knowledge, there is something out there in reality that we thus acquire. And I would also further argue that we immediately comprehend that our senses, which we use to get information, which our mind then comprehends, our senses must be directed at something beyond our minds, because our senses, by the very nature, import something from reality and brings it into our mind. And from there, you could perhaps argue for direct realism, which is the epistemological position that we directly sense the world as it actually is. This is a very controversial claim today, because there are many people who would say that, no, we can't actually know reality as it is. We can only know our own perception of reality. But I would argue that that's actually a false metaphysical understanding of the whole issue. I would argue that we can actually know reality as such. Now, that would be a huge conversation itself, but that's at least a point I would argue. And yes, when it comes to our minds and the principle of change, I would argue that yes, if it were absolutely necessary and it didn't need anything else beyond itself to exist, then it would be unchanging. But because our minds do change, there is, you could argue that metaphysically, that means that there is something that the minds depend on or is affected by, and therefore cannot be the prime foundation, the primary foundation of all reality. To dive more into that, that's a very interesting thing to talk more about. That's at least something I could state briefly.
Yes, interesting. I think that the question of what the senses exactly do, we have to discuss a little bit later, because so far we still don't know if the senses take in information or if they just take in illusions or whatever. But at least what we can say, I think, is that through this thing which we call the senses, something comes into the mind which previously was not in the mind. And so, yeah, I think that's at least something that I think cannot really be disputed. I'm kind of trying to also take the position of a skeptic. Perhaps a solipsist could say that, well, my mind is just creating these new things as I go along. So basically, I look over there and I see a tree. So that just means my mind has now created a tree. But it's not really, doesn't mean that something is outside of my mind. It's just that my mind has created this tree, perhaps like, I don't know, let's say you have like this, you know, these glass things where there is water and snowflakes inside.
These glass things with water, and yeah, could you repeat that?
Yeah, like there's a glass sphere. Sometimes there's a little town or a little house or something inside, and then when you shake it, then these snowflakes they whirl all around.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And so you could say that at every moment in time, the snowflakes kind of have a different state. They are in a different form, if you want to call it so, but still the whole thing is maintained in itself. It's just the water that is moving inside the glass that moves these flakes. There is nothing from outside that, well, that's not really true, but I mean, somebody could say, well, it's just my mind that produces these things. So yeah, we have to go to the senses a little bit later, but the point is that everybody would have to agree that the mind can change. It's not always the same. And so it's an interesting question, because you mentioned if the existence of the consciousness would be absolutely necessary, then that would mean that there cannot be anything on which it depends outside of itself. So everything which it needs would have to already be within it, so that it can just exist by itself without any factor from the outside. And so that makes sense to me. I'm not yet quite sure why from this it follows that it must be unchanging.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, I would love to explain why I would say that. But before I get into that issue, when it comes to the question of what if the mind simply produces perceptions, like when you see a tree or know about the tree, instead of actually receiving that information from the outside? Well, this is not something I've thought a lot about, but my initial thoughts when I think about it right now would be that first, suppose that we have this situation where the mind creates the perception of a tree within itself. Well, in order for the mind to be able to create that, it must presuppose that it already has the concept of a tree, and it can even translate that concept into an actual image of a tree. So in order for that to be possible, it must presuppose that it actually has the information of the tree in the first place. So hence it would make sense for it to simply produce it. Also, another, unless you wanted to say something briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that is a very good remark on this question, because we all know the experience of getting to know something which we didn't know before. So now I know a tree, and therefore I can produce the image of a tree in my mind. But there have been instances in my life where I have got to know something that I didn't know before at all. It was like completely, that's what we call, it blows my mind. And this expression actually means just that kind of the content of your mind is kind of expanded, like blown bigger by something that comes in from outside. And so that's, I think, a great point that you made here.
Thank you. Yes, interesting. And also you could say that all surprises are things that the mind acquire, or else it wouldn't be surprises. You would already be aware of them. And yes, so that's one point. And also the other point, I would say that we know that to imagine something in our head, in our mind, is not the same kind of thing as actually perceiving something. So for instance, when you go into the woods and you perceive a specific tree, and you see the tree with your sight, and you have that experience, you know that that's not the same kind of experience as you imagining the tree for yourself, making a mental image. And this is very easy to test. You could just try to think, okay, let's imagine a tree. So I have that in my head as a mental image. Okay, now I have that tree as a mental image. And then you go out and actually watch a tree or see a tree. You know that all those are two different kinds of experiences. To actually see the tree is something else than simply imagining the tree. So that's another issue as well. Yes, we could dive more into, okay, why would a necessary foundation of reality be unchanging? But if you wanted to address these points that I made now, you could do so.
No, I think that would be good to go into this question now.
Right, okay. So I think of two arguments for why it must be unchanging. The first one would be based on the principle that an absolutely necessary thing that is completely independent cannot be composed of parts. I remember we talked a little bit about this before, but I can address it again and say that anything that is composed of parts must have something beyond itself to explain why it is composed of parts. Because when you have a thing which is composed of parts, which has parts, then there must be something which organizes those parts into the thing it is, so it becomes a composite instead of those parts being isolated by themselves. But that which makes that the case cannot be identical to the thing itself, because the existence of that thing presupposes that it has those parts, because its very nature is to have those parts. Hence, we see that you can only make sense of that if there is something beyond the thing itself, making it the case that it has the parts that it needs in order to actually be what it is. So therefore, you could argue that every composite thing must have an external cause. But since we're talking about something that is absolutely necessary and independent in its being, it cannot have any external cause because it's independent. Hence, it cannot be composite. Now, from that, I would thus argue further that any kind of change involves that some part of the thing itself is replaced or simply cease to exist. If all the things about that thing were replaced, then it wouldn't have the thing at all anymore. It wouldn't change at all. It would simply be replaced with something else. But if you have the thing, it changes, but it continues to be the same thing. That means that there is some part of the thing replaced and other parts staying intact. But that would make sense with the independent thing, because it's not composed of parts, so it couldn't have that situation. Hence, it couldn't change. Now, also I could quickly mention another argument, which is that when something changes, then that either means that it gains something that it didn't have before, or it loses something that it previously had. Now, for an absolutely necessary and independent thing to lose something, it wouldn't make sense, because the thing in itself is absolutely necessary. There is nothing beyond itself which can affect its existence and its being. So one could ask, well, how could something lose a part of itself if it's necessary and absolute? And also, if it were to gain something, you could say that that wouldn't make sense either, because it is necessary and independent from everything else, so it couldn't gain something from other things. Perhaps this is something I could dive even deeper into, but that's at least a brief presentation of my two arguments for that.
Interesting, yes. I was just thinking, because I remember that we had this conversation once, I think not on camera, and the question that comes into my mind is, when we talk about a thing, as you said, being composed of parts, you said if something is composed of parts, then there must have been a cause that brought these parts together so that they build or make up this thing.
Or at least makes it the case that those parts are together at this moment.
Yes, but there I have two questions to this. And this, I think we are getting here perhaps into this argument of infinite regress. Because one question is, why can't the two parts just have been together since forever? And the second question I have just forgotten, so yeah.
Okay, well, I could briefly talk about an important distinction when it comes to causality and causal series. Actually, there are two kinds of causal series. That is, you have an effect and then you have the cause and the cause of that one and the cause of that one, or simply one cause. Either the causation is linear. That means that it happens through time. At some time in the past, you have a cause and it creates an effect, and the effect begins to exist, and then it exists today because of something happening in the past. And then if you talk about an infinite regress, you can talk about, okay, can there be causes going all the way back to infinity into the past? So that's one causal series. Another causal series is called hierarchical causal series. That means that we're not talking about something causing things to begin to exist in the past, in some point of the past, but rather causes, which makes it the case that they exist here and now, regardless of the past, and makes it the case that they are where they are right now. And for instance, Aristotle, he would argue that everything in existence other than the prime mover depends on the prime mover or the first mover as a first cause for its existence. So he would probably say that the universe has a cause, which is this first cause. However, he believed that the universe was eternal. It had no beginning. It always existed. So the kind of causality he had in mind was something sustaining it in existence instead of it simply ceasing to exist. So that's hierarchical causality rather than causality as in creating something from nothing in the past. So just to briefly mention that those are, there is a distinction there. So what thus I would argue is that an infinite regress here and now in the present moment is impossible for various reasons. Now, we could get into more why I believe that and how I would argue for that. But I would also point out that the argument I made for why the absolutely necessary independent being cannot change is independent from considerations about infinite regress, because I was not trying to make an argument for the existence of the necessary being, but I was rather pointing out that if we suppose that something is necessary and independent, it cannot change. So that's a separate question from whether we can prove that such a necessary being exists by way of causation. So I'm not sure if perhaps I could explain myself a little bit better, but that's at least what I'm trying to get at.
Well, it's really difficult to talk about these things. So what I have been thinking to your statements, I think in some sense, perhaps it's even impossible to really talk about these things, because I remembered my point that I wanted to make before, and the point is, you said if something is composed of parts, then there must be something else that made these parts to be together in the organization that they are. And that thing cannot be a part of the thing itself, because the thing's existence presupposes that the parts are together. So there must have been something outside that made them be together. And I think the point I wanted to make is here, what do you mean with the word part? Because in my mind, this statement of yours is correct if the word part actually refers to something that kind of is metaphysically an individual or a separate part in reality. Whereas the statement doesn't make sense if part is just a word like in our language, but doesn't refer to a separate metaphysical entity. And so the problem now is that our concept of metaphysics, our assumptions, yours and mine, influence even the way we think about metaphysics. Because, for example, we talk about parts being organized and something like that, but what actually is a valid part of reality as opposed to not an independent part? I think from our last conversation, we differ on that question, and therefore we see that it's kind of like circular. The assumptions about metaphysics influence how we talk about metaphysics.
So here we get into a very interesting and crucial issue when it comes to not only this particular topic we're discussing, but metaphysics itself, generally speaking. And that is how we can understand very deep concepts like parts or wholes or similar things. You could also talk about causality. And when you're trying to define those things, it's difficult because we're talking about so deep and fundamental metaphysical things, such as a part. If you just consider parts as such, what are they? Well, they're parts. It's very hard to sort of boil it down to something even deeper. And we would perhaps say that we comprehend parts and wholes as a way of them relating to each other. We understand what a part is because it has a certain relation to the whole, namely the relation of being part of what makes up the whole. And the whole, we know what the whole is because we makes it distinguished. We distinguish it from parts because the whole is that which has all the parts within itself. So sort of my point is that with certain very deep metaphysical things, we can only define them by virtue of their relation to other things, just as we understand what the part is because we understand what the whole is, and we understand what the whole is because we understand what the part is. And I would say that such deep metaphysical notions are things that we simply know or comprehend. We simply understand that a part is that which a part is, and we understand that the whole is what the whole is. And when we see, we can talk about specific manifestations of this principle. For instance, let's say you have a computer or a book in front of you. Here you have a physical thing, you have the whole, the book itself, and its parts, the paper and all the material which make up the book. So that's a manifestation of a deeper principle. So yeah, I'm not quite sure if I addressed exactly what your point was. So if you want to elaborate on your point, you could do that, because I'm not quite sure if I'm getting at what you're actually meant to address.
Yes, I think your point is correct, that certain deep metaphysical concepts, or you could also say very general words or categories like part and whole or object is also something like that, or entity. These things can only kind of be understood in relation to something else, or you could even say this is perhaps where our language kind of breaks down, and it's just a person has to, with their mind, understand the concept and just kind of know what it is. It's like when you explain to a child what blue is, then at some point you point at many things with your finger and say, this is blue, and this is blue, and this is blue, and this is blue. And then at some point the child realizes in their mind that you are talking about this specific characteristic that is constant over all of these instances where everything else is kind of changing. Because you could also say, well, there is kind of a blue book, and then there is a blue toy, and then there is a blue plate, and then perhaps there is something else. And so you could just say, well, this concept makes no sense, mixing a plate and the book and the cup and the toy in the same category. But you kind of just intuitively understand at some point, it's this characteristic of the color that is meant here. But why exactly that happens, it is not exactly clear, because you could also think, these are all solid objects. So solid means blue, but no, that's not how it works. And so at some point the ability of language to communicate an experience from me to you or to some other person is kind of limited. And with words like parts and wholes, this, you are right that there perhaps we start to reach this point. And I was wondering, as you were talking, if we could say the same of existence, that to exist is a concept that a person just kind of has to grasp what it means that something exists. And so perhaps that's why these metaphysical discussions are very difficult, or sometimes even you feel like at a certain point you can't get any further, because existence is also such a word which is very deep metaphysical concept. And so, yeah, that was something I was thinking now to the point I was making before. I think where we got stuck last time was this question on whether the matter and the form, kind of, you said that everything has both, that exists has both matter and form. And so these are two parts that have to be together in order for this thing to exist, and therefore there has to be something that made them be together that's outside of the thing itself. And I kind of refused to accept this as an argument, because in my mind, since I have an essentially materialist view of reality, the form is not a part that exists in reality like the matter is. So in my mind, a part of something that actually exists in reality is always something material. Like when you said the book is made out of paper and ink and some other things, these are all material things. And therefore, in my mind, calling the form a separate part doesn't work. And that comes from my metaphysical assumptions in the end.
Well, deep issues. I would sort of say that, yes, we have these general concepts, metaphysical concepts, and are very difficult to define because they are fundamental. You could say that definitions and explanations are based upon simple concepts, sort of like how elementary particles are sort of the stopping point on which every material thing is made of. In a sense, it's sort of an analogy to this in a way. I would say that even though it can be difficult to really define it because of this thing, I would say that still we know with certainty that these are real things, that these are realities out there, such as part in itself, whole in itself, matter and form in itself, are general concepts of principle which we comprehend and understand to be true, and we know them to be true, even though they are not necessarily material applications, but they are still true in itself. And perhaps here would be useful to make a distinction between conceiving of some reality and imagining some reality. So for instance, I don't think you talked about this explicitly, but I think this thing is related to what you say, and that is the idea of physical parts and metaphysical parts. I think we both agree that, of course, they are material things that have physical or material parts, such as the book or the cell phone or the chair, etc. And then some would doubt whether we can talk about metaphysical concepts, metaphysical parts, that is, parts that are not material physical parts, but parts on a much deeper level, such as form being the part of a being, for instance, or immaterial parts you could talk about. And I would say that we conceive, our mind or intellect conceives that, yes, the principles about parts, since they are true about material things, are also true about immaterial parts. Because, for instance, when we comprehend the principle that, well, all material or composite things that need parts or that have parts in their being needs an external cause. If we say, okay, yes, we comprehend this very well with material things because we are very well aware of material parts. Well, I would say that when we talk about these material parts, and when we reflect and examine what those implications of them having parts are, we are examining them on the aspect of them having parts, not on the aspect of them having physical parts. So the materiality or the physicality of what we're talking about is not the relevant thing. So I would say that whenever we make judgments about metaphysical things applied to material things, we are not restricting it to only be true of material things. We're simply applying a general principle to specific particular circumstances, such as material things we can see. But they're still nevertheless true of immaterial things, because when we say that a material thing which has parts needs something beyond the parts to exist, that is true by virtue of the thing having parts, not true by virtue of the thing having matter. And hence the same principle would apply to immaterial things with immaterial parts. Now, it's true that we cannot imagine that, we cannot make a mental image of these metaphysical things, because we're talking about a much deeper reality than the physical. But we can conceive of this being the case. We can conceive that an immaterial thing with parts needs some external cause, even though we cannot form a mental image of it because it's immaterial, it's invisible. We still comprehend abstractly that this must be the case. So yeah, perhaps I could have formulated myself a little bit better, but that's at least the best I can attempt to explain how I approach that whole issue. So I hope that was helpful.
Yes, I think now that was actually very helpful. And it's worthwhile to distinguish between talking about the physical parts of something and the metaphysical parts of something. I think that's very true, and that's a good that brings me further in this argument, because I was stuck with the physical parts. But when we are talking about existence or reality as such, then we can talk about the metaphysical parts of something. And so that's very helpful. Now, I do have an issue, however, with your assumption that the principles which we have derived from physical parts can be or have to be necessarily also applied or have to necessarily also hold for metaphysical parts, because we are speaking of something completely different, and therefore it's not per se clear that the same principles apply. There are many examples of this that you can make. For example, two individuals of an animal species can reproduce and create more instances of the same category, but two stones cannot reproduce and create more stones. Or, for example, if I have two solid objects, then there is a principle that, for example, a solid object has a clearly defined volume, but if I take a gas, then the gas doesn't have a clearly defined volume, but it just fills out the entire volume which is available. And therefore, it's not at all clear that principles which we derive from physical parts, like the fact that when two physical parts are together, then there must be some thing or force or effect that makes them be together or holds them together. It's not clear that this can be applied one-to-one to metaphysical parts like form and matter, for example?
So to this, I would say that the crucial thing is to talk about when we examine material objects and make true statements about them or conclusions. Under what aspect are we examining them, or we are examining certain things about them by virtue of what? So in other words, when we are examining a material thing and we realize that there are certain true things about that material thing, are those true statements true about that material thing by virtue of it being material, or by virtue of a much deeper principle? For instance, perhaps this is an easy application of this. So, okay, I have these two, let me get this. I have these two material objects here. And there is a general truth that is very obvious that we can make about them, that 1 + 1 = 2. So we have one material glass, another material glass, they make two material glass. And that's obviously true. But is it true by virtue of them being material things, glasses? No, because we know that this is a general metaphysical truth. They are true of everything that is one and another being two. So we could say the same thing about immaterial things. If we imagine not imagine, but conceive of some immaterial being and another immaterial being, when we add those together, we get two immaterial beings. So I would say that this is a sort of an application of this principle which I'm presenting, that when we are examining mathematical truths about this, we're examining them not by virtue of them being material, because the materiality is irrelevant to the principle. We're simply talking about them insofar as they are beings, and thus mathematical principles would apply to them. And since we're doing that, they would apply to all kinds of beings, material or not. And hence I would say the same thing about them being made of parts, and that whenever material things begin to exist, they need to have a cause, not by virtue of them being material, but by virtue of them being something that begins to exist. Hence it must be applicable to everything that begins to exist. So I hope that was helpful.
Yes, I mean, I see it's an interesting point that you brought up. By what standard or by what principle are we examining or comparing something? I think that's the question that you brought up here. I think it's worthwhile, but still, I think making these kinds of statements about metaphysical parts, if you want to call it like that, or making metaphysical statements like that this principle applies to all immaterial entities or realities as well. I think these are basically metaphysical assumptions that I don't think we are in a position to prove them actually. So, because yeah, it's just I'm having a hard time to explain it, but let's stick with this point where we got stuck last time, with the matter and the form being two parts of an entity. In speaking metaphysically, that everything that exists has some matter and a form. Now, I think that this statement is true, but for me it doesn't follow, therefore, that something must have brought these two parts together and made them be together. Whereas in the case of a material object that consists of more than one physical part, there it is, in my mind, I can comprehend, or I see the argument that there must have been some cause that brought these two physical parts together. But a physical part and a metaphysical part is, in my mind, something different. Not just, it's fundamentally different, and therefore the principle might or might not apply to both of them. And to merely state that it does apply to both of them is itself just a metaphysical claim or a metaphysical assumption, but it's not a proof or an argument that it is so.
Well, I would sort of emphasize the point that, okay, when we are making or comprehending truths about material things, by virtue of what about the thing are we making those statements? So when we see physical parts coming together and that must have a cause, is that a truth that we comprehend to be true by virtue of them being physical, or simply by virtue of them being parts? And that's it, sort of. Because if it's simply by virtue of them having parts, then we know that, oh, then the physicality is irrelevant, and hence it would be a truth, a general truth about all things that have parts. And
okay,
right.
Yes. No, I see your point. You could say the kind of the definition of a part is that it is a part of a whole, as we have said before. And therefore, it is kind of in the mind, it is conceivable that the part exists separate from the other part, which together make up the whole.
Yeah.
And so by virtue of us calling it a part of something else, it is in the mind conceivable that the part would exist not in combination, but separate.
Yes.
I see that. Okay, yes, I can see that.
Great.
Makes sense. Then again, now the question is, just because something is conceivable in the mind, does that mean that it is also conceivable in reality or actually exist in reality? Because as we said, metaphysics is the question of what exists or what is reality, what is there in reality. And so just because something is conceivable in the mind, I'm not certain that that would mean that it is that it has directly something to do with reality. What do you think of that?
Well, to put it briefly, I would sort of say that when we conceive of some truths that are sort of certain truths according to our conception, that conclusion that our mind makes, it's based upon the nature of what a part is and essential truths about the relationship between part, identity, and wholes and causation. And thus we will sort of realize that it must be true. We sort of recognize a metaphysical necessity there. Another application of that could be, this is very different from what we're talking about, but this precise analogy, I think, or to use this as an example, I think that can be useful. We know that it's inconceivable to have the situation where we have, say, someone who eats, but he doesn't eat anything. There is nothing that he actually eats. So we say he eats, but there is not an object of that eating. Similar with a person thinking, but is not thinking of something. We recognize that is inconceivable because it's impossible. To eat implies that there is something being eaten, and to think implies that there is something being thought. So this conception that we have, they refer to the nature of things in reality, and they refer to whether something is metaphysically necessary or impossible or metaphysically possible, etc. So yes, I would say that there was another point I also wanted to make, but right now I cannot recall it. What was that again? Well, perhaps this was something like this, that also when it comes to geometrical truths, we conceive of a general truth that transcends all particular application. For instance, let's say triangles. We know that triangles must have 3 sides, and you also have the theorem of Pythagoras about certain kinds of triangles. And we can make all sorts of particular triangles and draw them and measure them and realize, yes, this principle applies to all these triangles that we have drawn up here. But our mind comprehends that this must be true. For instance, this theorem of Pythagoras must be true of certain kinds of triangles in general, in itself. So it transcends particular application, and it's a necessary truth of certain triangles as such, or the general principle that all triangles must have 3 sides. We recognize that this must be true of triangles as such. So yes, we are thus comprehending something necessarily the case with reality. Perhaps this analogy fails a little bit, I'm not quite sure, but hopefully it at least helps explain my thesis or argument.
Yes, it does, I think, because what I'm starting to realize is that the thing we are actually talking about right now, we are no longer talking about actual physical entities in reality, but we are talking about concepts. And when you talk about concepts, then each concept has a certain essence, has a certain definition, and basically the definition says which characteristics are essential for something to belong to this category. And if it doesn't have these characteristics, then it does not belong to this category. So it's a purely kind of logical realm of ideas, if you want to call it like that, where you have just definitions and characteristics, and then you have logical statement like yes or no. Does it belong to this category, yes or no? And in this realm, we can know in the mind certain things to be true, kind of when the characteristics are there, then it belongs to the category, and when they are not there, then it does not belong to the category, and that is kind of certain. And also, as you said, these categories refer to the nature of things that actually exist, and therefore we can make certain statements about things that actually exist because by way of manipulating categories and definitions and characteristics.
I wouldn't say manipulating but rather examining or comprehending, or yeah.
Yes.
Right, so we have these truths, absolute necessary truths about concepts that we know to be true. And whenever we conceive of some particular application of this concept, that must be true of that application because the concept necessarily has this truth. If that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. And so therefore you could say that in this world of forms or of concepts, there is the concept of form and there is the concept of matter, and every thing that exists, these two parts are together. There is a form and there is a matter.
I wouldn't say everything that exists has both form and matter, but you could say every material thing has both form and matter at least.
Okay, that's more narrow, so it's easier to understand. And so every material thing has both form and matter, and therefore you would say in the world of concepts now, you argue that there has to be a cause for this observation.
Yeah, you could sort of say that, I suppose.
Why? Why does there have to be a cause for every statement in the world of categories?
Well, I'm not sure what you're trying to say, cause about statements. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Yes, because form is a concept and matter is also a concept. Form is a concept that is kind of one of these metaphysical parts that we have been talking about. There is not a form that exists physically in the world.
Right.
Form is a metaphysical part. And these metaphysical parts, I'm not sure if all metaphysical parts are concepts, but at the moment it kind of seems to me as if there is a very tight connection. And so the statement that, for example, where every material object has both matter and form, and so these two parts, the matter and the form, are together, is a statement about concepts, because both matter and form are a concept and not a physical part.
I think I understand what you mean. I would say, to be more precise, that these are necessary truths about the concept of matter and form, and hence it would apply to every, or let me put it this way, that when we examine the concept of a material thing, we understand that it must have both matter and form, still dealing with the concepts. Okay, so we have these necessary truths in the concept world, if you want to call it that. But we recognize that because of the essence of the concept of a material thing, it must necessarily have matter and form. At least that's what Aristotle and others argue. And hence, these are necessary truths about material things themselves. So we know that whenever we have an actual material thing in reality, it must be an application of the concept. And hence, whatever we say about the concept must also apply to every application of the concept. Hence, whatever we know about material things as such, conceptually, must be true of every particular material thing, because they are applications of that.
Yes, so far I agree. I think that's well phrased. But the question now is, for these truths about, like, let's say that there is the essence of a material thing, and the essence of a material thing is that it both must have matter and form. Therefore, this is a truth about the concept of a material thing, or about every material thing as such, that we can know for certain. That's okay, but then this truth doesn't have a cause. It just simply is a truth.
Or you're now talking about whether the principle of whether things composed of matter and form must have a cause?
No, I'm talking about that the truth, the truth as such doesn't have a cause. It's just a true description of reality.
Yes, I would agree. I don't think I claim that it must have a cause. Perhaps I misspoke, but
then there might be a something that we have to clear up on the way. Yes, so that's good. Because where did we start from? We started about the thing that is absolutely necessary, or that the thing that is necessary must exist by its own nature, and must therefore not be dependent on anything else to maintain its existence.
You could say that.
And then we went a long way. We talked about that your argument was it cannot be composed of parts because something must organize the parts into the thing, and that which organizes the parts is outside of the thing. Now, is this statement a statement about material things or material parts, or also about metaphysical parts?
It also applies for metaphysical parts because it's a statement about parts as such, irrespective of whether they are material or not.
Yes, by their nature, because a part is a part of a whole.
Yes.
Okay, so then, since the concept of a material thing has both the part of matter and the part of form, these two parts have to be brought together by something which is outside of themselves, which is neither part nor matter, that brings them together. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. You could also say that that which makes it a case that the composite exists must be beyond just the thing itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so where we started from was the question of whether consciousness can exist as necessity.
Yes, and this argument about why necessary being cannot be composed of parts, but also was related to why our minds would not be able to change if they were necessary and independent.
Yes, right. Yes, so we said the mind does change, and then your argument basically was something which is necessary in itself cannot change, because change implies that some part of it changes
or is replaced.
Yeah, let's talk about that. This second statement of yours, that change implies that a part is replaced or stops existing or comes into existence, where replaced is actually the same as stop existence and something new starts to exist. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so change would always imply that something goes into existence or comes out of existence.
Yes, some part of the thing that begins to exist or ceases to exist.
Yes, but again, that would be a metaphysical part and not a physical part.
Yes, or it could be a physical part, but it doesn't have to. It could be merely a metaphysical part.
Yes, so I'm just taking a note because it's so difficult to. So change implies that some metaphysical part of this entity chain comes into existence or stops existing.
Yes, could be physical, but could also be immaterial. But they are generally speaking a part, I would say.
Can we make one or two examples of this statement?
Yeah, let's say you have a soldier in a war and he is severely injured by an explosion. And let's say he loses a few of his fingers on his hand. You could say that the soldier as a human being has undergone change. He has lost physical parts, some of his fingers, in an explosion. So in a sense, he has changed.
Yes, and now that would be an example of a physical part going into or out of existence.
Right.
But I'm searching for an example where a metaphysical part, where no physical part goes into or out of existence, but still there is change. like perhaps one example that people might bring up is what happens in the instance that a living being dies. Because in that very instance, if at all it is an instance, but even if it is a process, then over the duration of this process, a metaphysical part, which we could call life, or the fact of being a living entity instead of just material, stops existing. Would that be fair to say? But all the matter is still there.
Sorry, could you repeat the same question?
Yes. So let's say you have a chicken and the chicken dies. Then the matter is still there, the chicken. There is no material part that has come into existence or gone out of existence. But metaphysically, there is, of course, an essential part which has stopped existing, and that is the life. So the life has stopped, and in that sense, that this chicken is now no longer belonging to the concept of living beings, but it's now no longer in this category. And so this attribute of being alive has stopped existing, if you want to say so.
Yes, correct.
Okay, and so that would be a way of an example where a metaphysical part stops existing, and therefore this entity changes from one category to no longer being in this category.
Right.
Could we find another example of this same thing? Let's say I have just two stones. Let's say the whole universe would just consist of two stones. And these two stones are kind of moving. So the distance between the two stones is changing. What is now stopping to exist or coming into existence?
Right, so the stones are moving away from each other?
Let's say, for sake of argument, yes.
Right, they're moving away from each other. Okay. And these were the only two things in the universe.
The only material things, yes.
Yes. That's actually a very good question, and I don't have a fully satisfactory answer to that, because when it comes to change of motion or change of location, how to understand that as metaphysical parts changing. I'm not entirely sure myself. I have to think more about that. Perhaps you could say that when they change location only makes sense or is only meaningful if the thing in question changes its relation to other things. And perhaps you could argue that that there is some metaphysical part which makes it the case that it has another relation. But yes, I am not quite sure.
Yes, I mean, because for me, this way of thinking, this metaphysical way of thinking, it's not very intuitive, because we have been trained in our education system to think in terms of natural science. And so therefore, I think it can be difficult to explain the world viewed through the lens of natural science, to kind of translate that into the world of metaphysical thinking. But we could, for example, I think one way this could perhaps be understood, since I'm not an expert on it, is at some point, let's say the stones are close to each other. So the property of closeness exists. And then at some other point, they are now far apart. And so the property of being close has stopped existing, and the property of being far has started to exist. I guess that's from how I understand this ancient worldview, that's perhaps how some people around Aristotle, or maybe even he himself, would see this.
Yeah, that's possible. Now, I'm not entirely sure of that myself, because when you talk about something having the attribute of being far apart or close, to me, it doesn't seem like it is an intrinsic part of the being itself. It simply seems like it is something it's very difficult to say, because it seems like that sort of attribute is simply an artificial thing we say about it, instead of it actually having that attribute. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps I have to think more deeply about it, because this could be going into the deep questions of what does it mean to move away from something, and what does it mean to change location? What is location? What is space? Very deep questions. But also, I just want to briefly point out as well that even if I don't have a sufficient answer for change of location, at least I would say that the principles I'm putting forward explains change within oneself, and thus we see that the mind cannot have parts, or sorry, if the mind, sorry, if you have something necessary, it cannot undergo inherent change, because it cannot acquire things, it cannot lose things, because then we are at least certainly talking about it having actual parts, even if someone argues that change of location is something different. But yeah, just a brief remark there.
Yeah, no, good point. Let's leave this example and go back to the main argument. So we said consciousness does change. That we agreed, because things can come into conscious awareness and they can also go out of conscious awareness. So it does change. And then there were two main arguments. And one thing is, you said something which is kind of necessary and kind of exists in and of itself for eternity necessarily. The question was, why must it be unchanging? And the argument had two parts. The one part was, if something is composed of parts, then there must be something that organizes the parts into the whole. And the thing which consists of parts depends on the thing which puts the parts together for its existence. Therefore, something which is necessary cannot consist of parts. And then the other point was that change is always when one part comes into existence or stops existing. And since we have said that the mind does change, in the sense that we even said things can come into the mind or go out of conscious awareness, the mind is made up of parts. And when it changes, certain parts start or stop existing. And therefore, the mind would depend on this thing which brings the parts together into the whole. And therefore, the mind cannot be necessary or self-sufficient in that it needs nothing else to exist, metaphysically speaking. I think that was your argument.
Right, yeah. That's good.
Interesting. I think I have not much more very intelligent to say about it. I think we could perhaps just present this argument with all our exploration of it to the audience, and perhaps see if something has an interesting comment on it, because I can't really add anything more productive at the moment, I think.
Well, this, as you said, is a very, very interesting discussion and issue, and one could dive more deeply into various aspects of this. But yes, perhaps this is something we could return to at a later point. And also, I would say that there are other reasons why our mind cannot be absolutely necessary and independent, and that would get into other attributes, which I would say that a necessary and independent thing must have, such as that its essence is existence itself, which we also have discussed in the past, and the idea that it must be infinite, that it cannot have any limits, and also things like you could also argue that we would be omniscient. We would know everything there is to know and could be known, because if something is absolutely necessary and independent, you could argue that it must only be one such absolutely necessary and independent thing, and hence it must be the cause of everything else in existence, which would sort of imply that it is all-powerful and omniscient. Now, to argue deeper about why this is the case, that will be a discussion itself, but I would at least mention that these are other reasons why I believe that our mind cannot possibly be God, to put it that way. Yeah, so to sort of summarize an important point, one of my arguments against solipsism is that we can know with certainty that God exists, so we at least have one entity outside of ourselves which must exist. So that would contradict solipsism, and also the principle that our perceptions must have a source in external reality, and all our concepts, well, it must come from somewhere. So yes, those would be perhaps some points which I found very interesting and important to this whole discussion. So yes.
Yes, I think that was a good addition that you made there to our conversation, kind of putting it in the broader context and opening up possibilities for future discussions, which I'm not have no energy to go in at the moment, and also it's been already over an hour, I think. But there is one crucial question now in my mind concerning this whole thing that we would have to also take with us to a next potential conversation, and that is when we are talking about these very just purely metaphysical principles or conclusions, or phrased differently, conclusions that have to do just with concepts and with metaphysical parts and not with material parts. There might be a certain metaphysical concept which is necessary as the basis of other metaphysical truths, and that concept would then be God, as you have explained very briefly just before. But many people then kind of import God from the metaphysical realm back into the reality. And there, I think, is still a big gap to be breached. So just because there is a certain reason that, or a certain thing in a metaphysical context like that, kind of brings form and part together, or something very abstract, it's still a long way from there to saying that something actually exists in reality. Well, again, in my mind, reality is material things, but yeah, I think there is also a big open question for me.
Right, so I would say this several points. First is that the question of the applicability of metaphysics and whether it concerns material things only or concerns things on a deeper level, I think this gets at the core of what metaphysics is. It's the very term metaphysics is about transcending the physical, metaphysics. So I would say that the very essence of metaphysics is to dive into principles behind things, regardless of whether they are physical or material or not. And hence, it wouldn't be purely material principles, it would be principles of beings as such, parts as such, wholes as such, whether they are physical or immaterial. And when it comes to the question of the existence of God, an important point about a series of arguments for the existence of God, such as the cosmological arguments, which I defend, you could say that, well, a lot of the argument deals with concepts and abstract truths or abstract conclusions or syllogisms, etc. However, the argument also would say that all of these abstract necessary truths, which lead to the conclusion God exists, is about the real world, because all those abstract intellectual thinking and deductions are based upon some principle or thesis, and this thesis is actually observed in reality. And thus, since we know that this thesis leads necessarily through this abstract logic to God, if this thesis exists in reality, then that must mean that God necessarily exists as well. So in other words, to put it very briefly, let's say we have the realm of concepts. We just think abstractly right now, and in this abstract concept realm, we understand and comprehend through a lot of thinking, abstract thinking, that if X exists, just X generally, then that necessarily entails that God exists. This is the conclusion of this abstract thinking. Now, if we know that X actually exists in reality, that means that the conclusion that God exists must also be in reality. For we know in the concept world that if X exists, God exists. And then we see, oh, in reality, in actual reality, X does exist. Therefore, God must exist. Now, of course, many people would dispute whether this abstract argument of if X exists, then God exists actually is true or not. I would argue that it is. But the point is that this abstract thinking can actually tell us something about reality, because it refers to some things that can exist in reality, and we see that certain things exist in reality, in which case the abstract logic is applicable. So yes, that would be one remark about it that is important to note.
Yes, I think there are a couple of other questions that we have to discuss in this whole kind of broader question that we are probably here in the end discussing about the existence of God. But one point would be that we need a definition of what we actually mean by God, because if we don't have a definition, then we cannot really discuss about whether it exists or not. And the other thing is also this question of where do concepts come from and what are concepts actually? So I think there are a couple of important basics that we have to establish perhaps before we can get into the very final meat of the matter, like the most fundamental question.
That is, as you said, the question of God's existence and other issues. That's something we could dive more into, and I would be happy to do so in a future conversation. And yes, also another point is that the deepest metaphysical question of them all, at least according to some, is the question, why is reality the way it is? Or why is there something rather than nothing at all? And the answer to the question, I maintain, would be the existence of something necessary, God. And therefore, you could argue that the question of God's existence is the deepest issue of metaphysics, because God is the source of everything else that metaphysics concerns. So that's also an interesting point to consider. But yes, sure, we can return to this subject in the future and dive more deeply into the issue itself. So I'll be very open to that.
Great. So yes, I think that would be kind of an open end for this conversation about metaphysical principles, what is metaphysics, and then we kind of dived into solipsism, and by trying to understand this position or to point out flaws in it, we kind of dive deeper and deeper into metaphysical questions about what it means that something exists eternally or exists by necessity or exists independently of anything else. So yeah, it has been interesting, and yeah, I would be interested in comments from the viewers. What did you think of all of this, if you watched this far? And yeah, I thank you for having this conversation. It was an interesting exercise of the mind, I think. Yes.
Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. I also enjoyed it. This was very interesting, valuable, and we discussed many deep and important issues in metaphysics. So I think this has been a good discussion. And yes, if the audience have any comments to what we have talked about, please describe or put some comments in the comment section below. Of course, be civilized. We know that some people might be having some heated arguments, but yes, as long as it's civilized, please tell us what you think in the comment section below. So again, I thank you, Amos, for joining me in this discussion. And I'll just end by saying that I hope you and the audience will have a great Friday and a great weekend, and I'll let you have the last word.
Yes, I will just say the same. I wish you and the audience a great weekend, and I will see you all in another video next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.